So Clara Deser, our distinguished speaker today, she's a senior scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado in the US, where she leads the climate analysis section. Her research focuses on global climate variability and change. She's particularly interested in the interactions between the different parts of the climate system, the atmosphere, the ocean, and the sea ice. And she works with both observations and numerical models, and she's really pioneered the use of large ensembles of coupled climate models to distinguish forced climate signals from internal variability. Recent projects include the role of this internal variability in regional climate change, the effects of projected Arctic sea ice loss, and asymmetries between El Niño and La Niña. But today she's going to talk to us about the unique fingerprints of greenhouse gases and aerosols on climate change as revealed by the Community Earth System model. So thank you, Clara, for agreeing to talk to us, and I'll ask you to share your screen now and take it away.
Thank you so much, Helen. So appreciate this invitation. And, you know, virtually is as good as we can do these days. And I'm very happy to be able to be here. And thank you all for tuning in. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and begin my slideshow. Okay, I hope you can all see this. So thank you very much. It's a real honor to speak to you today. So I'll talk about the evolving roles and emphasis on evolving roles of anthropogenic aerosols and greenhouse gases in patterns of climate change. So really my emphasis is on evolution and patterns. This work, it was much of what I'll say today was actually published in the Journal of Climate in September of last year, but I've added a little bit of new work, and there's a lot to pursue here. It's a very broad topic, obviously, and I'm only cutting off a very small piece. And all of the simulations that I will be showing you today, they are available to anyone. Very easy to access, and there's so much, I think, to be learned from these simulations. So very broad brush motivation, obviously. The aerosols and greenhouse gases are considered to be the dominant drivers of forced global climate change. They derive mainly from two sources: fossil fuel burning, which of course emits precursors that eventually become sulfate and other types of aerosols, which as a whole cool the planet. And biomass burning would be another primary source of smoke, of aerosols in the form of smoke aerosols, which also have sort of a mixed cooling and warming effect. And at the same time, of course, these activities by humankind also emit greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, etc., into the atmosphere. And so they really have this dual role in causing man-made climate change. So aerosols, it's a very complicated topic. I'll speak to that in a moment, but if we just step back and really just look at the sort of global mean view, simplistically, in the net, aerosols, when one increases these different types of aerosols, there's a net cooling of the planet, and this is accomplished primarily by the scattering of solar radiation and how aerosols alter properties of clouds. On the other hand, of course, greenhouse gases, by trapping infrared radiation, cause a net warming of the planet as a whole. They're also distinctive not only in their effects on the planetary radiative energy balance, but also in their spatial and temporal character. So aerosols, as I'll show you, it'll be a main theme of this talk, are very heterogeneous in both space and time. Whereas, of course, greenhouse gases, well mixed spatially, and their rise has been sort of monotonic in time. So aerosols, very complicated and uncertain, and many of you in this audience are the leading, scientists in this field. I do not at all pretend to be an expert. I'm just using the simulations that are given to me. So aerosols are very complicated and uncertain. They have, combination of absorbing and reflecting properties. Very incomplete knowledge of their radiative and microphysical effects. The emissions of aerosols are uncertain. They're being revised for the different CMIP exercises. And their efficacy, at least on the radiative energy balance and the hydrological sensitivity, very much depends on their location. And some references are given here. I have a lot more in my paper. So all that aside, we're now going to sort of look at their bulk effects without worrying about how well they are represented in climate models. So I'd like to speak a little bit to the heterogeneity of anthropogenic aerosols. When I Googled smog, I think I got this, the first image that came up turned out to be from Denver, which is right near Boulder where I live. And this must be, considering the vintage of the cars, I'm going to guess it's sometime in the 60s or 70s when there was a lot of pollution and a lot of cars. And so here is the time series, sort of a proxy for aerosols, aerosol optical depth. And this is actually taken from our model, and I will explain those model simulations in a moment, forced with the aerosol emissions that are prescribed in the CMIP-5 exercise. But I think to the degree that this is a realistic depiction, one can see, of course, as we all know, North America and Europe, real ramp up in the aerosols from the mid part of last century to about 1980 or so, when at least in the US, Clean Air Acts were established, and then a rapid drop off in the aerosols since then. So that's the record, the time series for North America and Europe combined. But then we can look at, of course, a very important region of development, South Asia, South and East Asia, where the estimates are, although they are being revised, sort of just a steady increase in aerosol emissions since the mid-1950s. So a very different time series. And then one can look at another region. This is for tropical Africa and South America. This is primarily due to biomass burning aerosols rather than industrial sector aerosols. And, these are, of course, estimates. I don't know quite how realistic they are. But again, a very different character to the timing of when aerosols increased. So taken together, this means that the large-scale, radiative forcing on the planet is very changes geographically with time. So here I'm just showing you for this sort of early period, and I'm going to be using these time periods throughout the talk. These would be the trends in aerosol optical depth, a measure of the burden of aerosols in this model. The 50-year trend, linear trend from 1930 to 1980, and you can see that it's primarily, of course, located over North America, Europe, and the tropical areas. So that's sort of a, very large scale, if you will, pattern of emissions that will affect the radiative energy balance. If we then step forward 20 years and look at the 50-year period from 1950 to 2000, the lower latitudes look very similar to the previous period, but there's an absence of change over North America and Europe, because that's when they are starting to decline. So as a whole, there's no change in this period. So this is really a more of a low latitude radiative forcing for the planet. And then we step through to the most recent 50-year period. And again, it's not just a mirror image of what we've seen before. So yes, now there are strong declines in the aerosols over North America and Europe, but India and Southern Eastern Asia are continuing to emit aerosols. So again, it's a very heterogeneous pattern spatially, and it evolves with time. And that's really a big theme of my talk that I hadn't really seen brought out before in the literature. And then, as we all know, greenhouse gases their hallmark is that they're well mixed in the atmosphere to first order. These are actual measurements going from Alaska down to the South Pole, from different stations and islands in the Pacific. And apart from the seasonal cycle, which of course depends on location, if you're near vegetation or not, the slow upward trend or rapid upward trend in the CO2 concentrations is almost identical at each location. So the context for our study, and this is very broad brush, a lot of detail in the paper to underpin these concepts, but at least my reading of the literature when we first began this study was that previous work on the large-scale climate impacts of aerosols was mainly based on a limited and diverse collection of climate models, each of which had a different representation of aerosol microphysics. So i.e., the CMIP5 models that conducted aerosol-only experiments. And in terms of analysis, often the focus was regional, so particular interest in the Asian monsoon or Sahel rainfall or European climate, that kind of thing. Or if a global view was taken, it was in a static fashion. So it would be sort of contrasting two time periods, typically pre-industrial with present day, or some other, two fixed time periods. But there hadn't really been any study that tried to look at the evolution of the global patterns through time. And that's really what I'm going to speak about today. And then, of course, there have been quite a bit of work on contrasting or comparing the effects of aerosols and greenhouse gases. And I particularly wanted to call out these two papers that looked at, that came to opposite conclusions in terms of the response patterns. That the first paper by Shea et al. Really highlighted how similar the large-scale patterns of air temperature and sea surface temperature and precipitation response was to the aerosols and the greenhouse gases, although of opposite sign. And then this other paper of Wang et al. Really highlighted the differences between them. And I feel like they're both right. And it's really what I've seen here in our study is that it's really a matter of what time period you're looking at to see these similarities and differences come out. And then there's been work on whether there are nonlinear interactions, whether the sum of the effects of the individual forcings is the same as if the forcings occur in combination. And I point you to some papers here. For the work I'm going to show today, there's very little evidence of any nonlinearity. I would say the primary region is in the Arctic, in the regions of ice cover, sea ice cover, which does seem to show a nonlinear impact of these forcing factors. So we have two overarching guiding questions for this study. The first, and that's what I'll spend the bulk of my time on, are what are the evolving contributions of aerosols and greenhouse gases to patterns of forced climate trends? So that's one question. And then the other, which is very different, is once we've established the fingerprint of these aerosols and greenhouse gases through time, how detectable are their effects in any single model simulation and in the observations? And to address these questions, we use a single climate model, the CESM1, with enough realizations to reduce confounding effects from internal variability, and I'll speak about that in a moment. I may not get to the second part, which I'm happy to discuss with people offline, but the short answer is that there's a lot of noise from internal variability. Of course, it does depend on region and season, but overall, it is difficult to pick out in the historical record in terms of these large-scale patterns, these forced impacts. So community Earth system model, this is version 1. Just tell you a bit about it. If you're not familiar, it's a global coupled Earth system model. Spatial resolution is roughly 1 degree in latitude and longitude, with much finer resolution in the equatorial region in the ocean. Primary components are atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, land, and some attempt at biology. For this, the important things for this study about the aerosols, they are prognostic. They do contain direct representations of both the direct effects and the indirect effects of aerosols, i.e. cloud-aerosol interactions. And the radiative forcing, effective radiative forcing of aerosols in this model by others has been quantified as this minus 1.37 watts per meter squared, which according to a recent review paper of Bellouin et al. Is sort of within the plausible bounds, but maybe that is, being revised as we speak, I'm not sure. But I think the model is reasonable. And then just to say that there is a diagnostic carbon cycle in the model, but there are no feedbacks of that carbon cycle onto the atmospheric CO2. Okay, so the experiments that we'll be analyzing, we begin with this baseline experiment, which was run probably about 6-7 years ago now. This is the so-called large ensemble. This was a set of simulations with this version of the model where all of the known natural and anthropogenic radiative forcings were applied, taking from the CMIP-5 protocol for the historical and the future under the RCP 8.5 scenario. We ran 40 simulations for this time period, 1920 to 2100, where each of the simulations begins from a very small perturbation to the atmospheric initial conditions. So that's what's referred to now as the large ensemble and written up in this Clara Deser paper. So what you're seeing here in the time series is the global mean surface temperature. The black curve is the average of those 40 ensemble members or simulations. So that's sort of the forced response to the forcing. And then the shading gives you the spread or the range across the ensemble members, and that's due only to internal variability by the design of the experiments. And then the blue curve is the observational record. It doesn't matter very much at all which record we use. This is the Berkeley Earth product. And you can see the model does a very credible job throughout this historical time period, lying within the ensemble spread. So the model by this metric is quite realistic. So the new experiments, we call them all but, not very good English. We keep one forcing type fixed at 1920 conditions, but and then run the simulations out with all of the other forcings that were used in the baseline experiment. So we had enough computing resources to do this set of runs where we kept the industrial sector or energy sector aerosols fixed at 1920 levels, and we ran a 20-member ensemble. It's the same model version, so we can, it's apples to apples here. Then we did a 15-member ensemble where we withheld any change in the biomass burning aerosols. And then we ran a third set where we kept the greenhouse gases fixed and ran a 20-member ensemble. For what I'll show you today, I've combined the impacts of the industrial sector and the biomass burning aerosols. I think it would be interesting to look at them separately, and we've done some of that, but for this talk, I've combined them. So the way that we derive, of course, the impacts of these withheld forcing types or agents is to take the all forcing ensemble mean minus the fixed forcing ensemble mean. And then if you have enough ensemble members to average out the internal variability, you can get the impacts of that forcing, particular forcing factor, including its nonlinear interactions with the other forcing agents. So here, just coming back to the global mean surface temperature, this is now showing you these derived impacts after subtracting from the all forcing experiment. So again, the black and the gray shading, that's the all forced, which you saw before, global mean surface temperature. The pink there, that's just the greenhouse gas effect, the way that we've derived them. And the blue is the aerosol effect. So it's just giving you a sense for what that looks like and the internal variability. So we're going to now be looking at maps. As I mentioned before, I'm particularly interested in the spatial patterns of the climate response. And will be, just as a parsimonious way to look at maps over the evolving maps over this historical period, we've chosen to look at linear trends over 50-year periods. And we'll show you maps for the 1930 to 80 period. I showed you already the aerosol trend map. Then we move forward 20 years and look at 1950 to 2000, and then we finally look at the last 50-year period that we have in the historical record. So I'll show you a more general result of just running 50-year trends, but in terms of the maps that I'll show you, we've just looked at these discrete periods. The reason we started in 1930 was to just get a little bit away from any ocean initial condition memory, since these simulations start in 1920. And it doesn't, our results really are not sensitive to whether we use 40 years or 30 years as our trend interval. The results are quite similar. Okay, so we're going to look at a bunch of maps, and I'll just describe what they are, and then we'll get familiar with them. So these maps are the sea surface temperature trends for these three overlapping 50-year periods in the last roughly 100 or 90 years of the historical time period. So you see the color bar in the bottom there, and the stippled areas are areas where the trends are not significant according to a student t-test at the 5% level. So, of course, evolution of the patterns and magnitudes of sea surface temperature changes In the early period, it's sort of an interhemispheric asymmetry, largely one of cooling in the northern hemisphere and warming in the southern hemisphere. Well known due to, well, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. That's what it looks like. Then the middle time period is characterized by a fairly bland pattern where overall there is warming at almost all locations of the global oceans, a little bit still of that north-south asymmetry, but overall is sort of a general bland pattern of warming. And then by the time we get to this most recent 50-year period, of course, the warming has accelerated, as evidenced by the brighter red colors there. And you're beginning to see in this model, and I think many climate models show a tendency for amplified warming on the equator relative to off the equator. So I call this a more symmetric pattern of warming. So the pattern really changes a lot through the historical record. So now we can look at the contributions of aerosols and greenhouse gases to these patterns. And the beauty of our simulations is that they're all using the same version of the climate model with a lot of ensemble members, so we can really do this quite effectively. So here you're seeing the same trend intervals, but now just from the combined and industrial and biomass burning aerosol effects. So as I mentioned before, of course, aerosols overall cause a cooling, but their imprint on the ocean surface temperature changes as the aerosol emissions change geographically through time. And what you see here, those numbers in the upper right are showing you the pattern correlation, the spatial correlation between the aerosol-induced SST trend and the full trend in the all-forcing run. And you can see that the earliest period has a very strong pattern correlation to the all-forcing run, 0.63, and then the pattern becomes less and less like the all-forcing as you come to the present. And that's in contrast to greenhouse gases, which we would anticipate just sort of their effect just increases in magnitude through time. And you can see that these just evidenced by these pattern correlations is a useful metric that by the time the early on, the pattern has little resemblance to the all-forcing run. And by the time you're at the most recent 50-year period, that pattern is very similar to the all-forcing, although it is offset somewhat by the aerosols. And I'll get to that in a moment. And then we can look at how the responses to aerosols and greenhouse gases compare. And these green numbers are the pattern correlations between the aerosol-induced effects and the greenhouse gas-induced effects. And early on, there's very little insignificant pattern resemblance, and at the end, nothing, no pattern resemblance. But this middle time period, this is significant. Negative pattern correlation minus 0.62, just telling you, and you can see by eye, that the patterns are really similar. You just have to reverse the sign in your head. And I think this is sort of what's been not quite brought out in the literature, as I mentioned in the introduction, that this resemblance or lack of resemblance really depends on the time period that's under consideration. So again, just reiterating, the patterns of trends forced by aerosols is very time dependent, whereas it's sort of to first order time invariant due to the greenhouse gases. And I will say we haven't done this yet, but we plan to do a heat budget analysis to really understand these mechanisms of pattern formation similar to an earlier study of Shea et al. So now let me just quickly show you the precipitation trend maps. I don't really have to introduce the format here. It's the same as for the sea surface temperature. You'll notice there's a bit more stippling, i.e. a little bit less significance on the precipitation. And again, sort of a hemispherically asymmetric trend pattern at the beginning of the historical record, and that evolves very a lot. And sort of by the time we get to this most recent 50-year period, it's it's intensified in the equatorial region, and it has a lot of symmetry about the equator. And then once again, let's break it down in terms of the aerosol effects and the greenhouse gas effects. And the story is quite similar as for the sea surface temperature. The pattern correlations with the all forcing is very high, even higher than it was for the SST, 0.84 at the beginning, and that sort of disappears through time. And then the greenhouse gases, that pattern is very steady through time. The magnitude of the pattern increases. And by this most recent period, you get a very high spatial correlation with the all forcing run. And then the cross correlations are shown here. And once again, there's something unique about this second half of the 20th century in terms of how aerosols and greenhouse gas patterns really offset one another. They resemble one another with the opposite sign. So now we can be much more general about these results, and we can do these pattern correlations as our metric, but we can do it for all running 50-year trend periods over this interval 1930, and now we'll go all the way out to the end of the simulations, which is 2080. So I'm just fitting 50-year trends for every start year during this time period. And I'll just show you as a summary what these pattern correlations look like so we can see how they behave. So that's what's shown here, pattern correlations for running 50-year trends. This is for precipitation. It doesn't matter if we just zero in on the tropics or the globe. It's very, very similar, either one. And so I just want to orient you here. So the x-axis is the start date for the 50-year trend. So the first point on here is the trend from 1930 to 80. Then this gray line is sort of the end of the last point you can get to fit within the historical period, 1970 to 2020. And then we're going all the way out to a 50-year trend that begins in 2030. So we're going out into the future. So the blue curve is the pattern correlation between the aerosols and the all forcing run. The dashed curve here for these future time period is because we didn't extend the biomass burning simulations that far. It doesn't really matter. The biomass burning changes in the future, at least in these CMIP5 experiments, are not very large. So what's very simple behavior here, and you can really see that the handoff, if you will, between an aerosol-dominated pattern in the all-forcing experiment and a greenhouse gas-dominated pattern occurs somewhere in the second half of, for 50-year trends beginning in the early 1950s. So that's when that handoff occurs. Very similar result in terms of that crossover point. If we look at sea surface temperatures in the tropics, not surprising, precipitation and SST are highly related through spatial gradients in the SST. And then finally, we can look at the global SST pattern correlations. And again, that crossover point is very, very similar. So as I said, that handoff happens for 50-year trends that are centered in the 1970s. So again, we're allowing the patterns to change in time, and we're just looking at when aerosols and greenhouse gases dominate. And then here in the bottom maps panels, this is then these pattern correlations between the aerosol effects and the greenhouse gas effects. And you can see this very interesting behavior for all three quantities, that there is a sizable, and especially for the sea surface temperature, negative pattern correlation that is unique to this time period of the second half of the 20th century. And I think that helps to reconcile these conflicting results here of these studies of Shea and Wang et al., which really didn't accommodate for any spatial changes in the aerosol-induced patterns. They just took a sort of a single EOF view, if you will, of the aerosol effects. So I think that's one of our important results here. So just showing you what these trend patterns look like. We saw these maps before for the 1950 to 2000 period. And you can really see that strong resemblance in the patterns, just the opposite sign. And here are the aerosol optical depth trend maps that you saw at the beginning of the talk for this time period. And my hypothesis is that, and we have yet to test this, of course, in a more idealized framework, but that maybe in some sense, the fact that there's an absence of extratropical aerosol changes during this time period that is allowing this aerosol-induced pattern to mimic the greenhouse gas-induced pattern. So somehow this very large-scale, low-latitude aerosol emissions are somehow engaging the large-scale ocean atmosphere kind of feedback processes that can then allow these response patterns to become very, very similar. And then I think there also may be a role for a delayed AMOC-induced Atlantic response to the earlier aerosol increases from the 50s to the 80s over North America and Europe. So anyway, we have yet to explore these hypotheses in more detail, but at least we sort of come to some clear questions. And then just coming back to these curves, I think also, in the future, if these aerosol and greenhouse gas emissions actually play out the way that they are prescribed in the CMIP-5, we might expect a similarity in the patterns induced by aerosols and greenhouse gases. So they would act to reinforce one another in the pattern. So that's interesting. And I think that may be because there are projected declines, throughout much of these regions during this time period. Okay, so then I think I'll maybe just skip this, but just to say the upshot of this diagram is that because of the offsetting patterns between aerosol and greenhouse gas induced impacts, the interval from the second half of the 20th century is actually the worst time to look for force trends because they're weakest, because of this offsetting or these pattern correlations. So when we try to attribute trends in the real world during this second half of the 20th century, it's actually difficult, or more difficult than earlier or later in the historical record because of this this compensating patterns between the aerosols and the greenhouse gases. So I'm going to wrap up. I think I'll take another 5 minutes and just, I won't get through all of this. It's fine. It's all in the paper, and I'm really be more than happy to talk with any of you further offline. So how detectable are the impacts of aerosols and greenhouse gases in any individual simulation and in the observations? And of course, they may not be very detectable because internal variability may mask their effects. So to address this, again, we're going to use the same approach of using pattern correlations as our metric. And we're going to look at running 50-year trends, but this time, instead of just dealing with the ensemble means, i.e. the force quantities, we'll look at how the patterns in any individual simulation resemble the ensemble mean pattern or the forced pattern. So you'll see what I mean when I introduce the figure to you. So it's a little complicated, but I'll spend a little time and then I'll wrap up with my conclusions. So here you're looking at, this happens to be for precipitation, and this is for the all forcing experiment. And these are pattern correlations, each with the forced response in the all forcing simulation. So each gray curve, there are 40 of them, and that's how the patterns in any individual simulation resemble the forced pattern as a function of this running 50-year trend. And the black curve is the average of the gray. So not to be confused with the results I showed you in the first half of the talk. So on average, and it's quite sobering that, you know, if you look at this time period, for trends starting in the 1960s, you have this, the possibility anyway, of this wide range due to internal variability. You could get a pattern correlation as low as 0.1 or as high as 0.7, let's say. And, that's implies low detectability, right? And on average, the pattern correlation is only maybe 0.45 or something. So don't expect that you can see it necessarily in any individual member, at least during this time period. Later on, of course, we can see it a lot. You know, the pattern correlations are a lot higher and a lot more consistent. In fact, this colored bar here is showing you the percentage of the simulations with an R-squared pattern correlation of either 50% or 75%. And if we use this 50% R-squared value, you have to wait until trends starting around now, or maybe 5 years ago, when 90% of the members actually exceed that pattern correlation. And then we can look at the same thing for just the individual simulations within the aerosol ensemble or the greenhouse gas ensemble. And you can see it's even more difficult to find that pattern in any individual simulation in the aerosol ensemble. And then the greenhouse gas ensemble, again, very difficult to see that. And this is what the results look like for sea surface temperature. Just the take-home message is that you can detect these patterns earlier and more robustly in the SST field, global SST field, than the precipitation, but there's still a lot of spread. Okay, and then the very last thing is just to add onto those diagrams the observed result, pattern correlations with the observations. So we've taken the observed record using these data sets and just treat them, just do the pattern correlation between their trends, the observed trends, and the ensemble mean trends. And here they are for precipitation, global sea surface temperature, and global 2-meter air temperature. I haven't shown you that before. And this is just the pattern correlations with the all-forced experiment. And the blue curves are lying at the very bottom, if not outside of the ensemble spread. So that the shapes are similar, but the blue curves really are sort of below. And so you'd say it's likely that there are model biases, and we don't know if it derives from the signal, from the noise, or the signal to noise. And or observational error. So I think I'm going to end it here and just go to my very broad brush conclusions. I'm just going to skip these just for lack of time, and we can talk about it in the discussion if you're interested. So conclusions: forced SST and precipitation trends in the CSM1 all forcing ensemble show a very pronounced evolution from an interhemispheric structure that's dominated by aerosols before the late 70s to an equatorially symmetric pattern dominated by greenhouse gases thereafter. And importantly, that aerosol force trend pattern has very strong evolution as with time as the geographical pattern of emissions changes. And that similarity with the greenhouse gas induced pattern is unique to the second half of the 20th century, when aerosol changes are mainly located at low latitudes. I didn't show you this, I just spoke about it, but there is actually a minimum in the amplitude of these patterns during the second half of the 20th century as a result of these compensating greenhouse gas and aerosol effects. And then internal variability greatly limits the detectability of force trends in individual model realizations in the historical period and in the observations. And so next steps, we hope we and others really invite anybody to look at these simulations, maybe to be a little more sophisticated than what I've shown you here in the analysis technique, maybe use signal to noise maximizing techniques, but one has to accommodate changes in the spatial patterns. And it's not enough to use a single EOF to represent the aerosol, as previous work has done. Examine model dependency and then idealized experiments to really probe the mechanisms of the response to the changing aerosol distribution. And so, as I said at the beginning, so first of all, thank you very much for listening. And as I said at the beginning, all simulations that we run as part of the Climate Variability and Change Working Group of the CSM project are available to anyone, very easy to download, and you're welcome to get in touch with me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara, for a really, really interesting presentation. I was trying to work out how to clap virtually. There we go. So I'm sure there are questions out there. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand virtually. So to do that, I think it depends a little bit which version of Zoom you're on. If you go to the participants list, you can do it from there, using the More tab next to your name, I think. And if you, you're welcome to type your questions in the chat. And we will invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So there is a question already there from Andrew Williams. So Andrew, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Clara. Great talk. Thank you. I was just going to ask. So in the future RCP scenarios, you said that the aerosols kind of there's a decline across North America, Europe, and South Asia. But the pattern correlation between aerosols and greenhouse gases becomes really high for when you have trends starting in like 2030 and stuff.
Right.
I can't quite make sense of that. Why would the pattern of the trends be similar when the aerosols are decreasing like that over that period?
I think they're causing then a warming effect, and their emissions are very widespread, at least through low latitudes and the northern hemisphere. So maybe in some sense it's a more diffuse and global scale forcing. So I think it would be nice to set up just idealized experiments to explore, that. But I think it's as simple as that. I should say that, of course, this is all, made up sort of emission scenarios. So we don't know if they'll play out. But in terms of the amplitude of the effects, I haven't shown you, but you have to sort of balance the pattern effect resemblance with how strong the impacts are. And the greenhouse gases obviously dominate late, in this century, or projected for this century. But I do think it's interesting, this interplay in how the pattern induced by the aerosols sort of comes and goes depending on that geographical distribution.
Thanks, Clara. And Andrew, there's a question from Tim Palmer.
Hi, Clara. I'm just trying to think of exactly the question now, but it's sort of, I'm trying to decide whether your results have anything to say about, I guess, what is a controversy at the moment in the CMIP6 results, which is that a number of models, certainly the Met Office, and I think possibly the latest NCAR model as well, have quite high climate sensitivities, much higher than the CMIP5 sort of ensemble. And the argument is, and this seems to be associated with some enhanced cloud feedbacks in the models, but the argument is that we don't see this sort of enhanced warming in the sort of 20th century because of offset by aerosols, and then it kind of takes off in the 21st century with the decline of aerosol forcing. But then I was looking at a paper very recently, and I think Brian Soden was one of the co-authors in an AGU journal that claimed, and this is where it comes to your work, they claimed that if that was the case, you should expect to see a higher degree of warming in the southern hemisphere in the 20th century, because the aerosol forcing would be less in the southern hemisphere compared to the northern hemisphere. And because you don't apparently see this asymmetry in warming in the 20th century, their conclusion was that these very high equilibrium climate sensitivities is probably wrong, and the fact that they're offset by strong aerosol forcing in the 20th century is probably wrong. I'm just wondering, do any of your results sort of shed any light on this? Because it's obviously an issue if we sort of severely misjudge what the climate sensitivity is. We need to know whether that's right or not.
Well, thank you for that question. First of all, please send me Brian Soden's paper. I am not aware of it. It sounds extremely interesting. The Southern Ocean surface has cooled a lot, and it's not an artifact of data. I'm convinced of that in the observations since roughly the late 70s. Maybe it's starting to warm up in the last couple of years. That cooling, it's certainly not seen in the forced response in the all forcing runs, nor do we find it a cooling of that magnitude in any individual ensemble member. So I do think there is some, either highly unusual occurrence in the real world, or we're really missing something in the models. And I think it's partly, internal variability, and it may also be partly a forced response. But it does, that cooling in the observations, it certainly it's an important component when you're looking at patterns. So you don't care about sort of the global mean, you're just looking at the deviations from the global mean. So it becomes an important ingredient for these pattern correlations. It's such a good question, and I have to read that paper and really think about whether these results have some implications. I had only thought of these equilibrium climate sensitivity results, in terms of global mean quantities, or these differences now, I think, work of, forget his name, with the cloud feedback sort of compensating changes between the tropical clouds and the mid-latitude clouds over the Southern Ocean, that maybe, you know, we were doing both wrong, and now we're doing both a little better, and now they've revealed, you know, some change in the sensitivity. But
Yeah.
these patterns might be an important component of it. Thank you.
I'm sorry to spring it on you. I tell you what, I'll email you the paper, and we can carry on, you know, by email later on.
That's perfect. And thank you.
It also sounds like a good question to chat about in the pub when we move over to structured sessions.
Very good.
Are there other questions out there? Whilst you're thinking about what you want to ask Clara, I'm going to ask mine, exercise the chair's privilege. I'm curious about what's going on in the North Atlantic, Clara. The aerosol impact in all the periods seems to lead to a warming trend. Can you say a bit more about why that is and how big you think the impact on the ocean might be?
So actually, I know Philip Steer is not here anymore, but I guess one of his group members, Dagan, they have a paper that analyzes these runs and looks at the delayed response of AMOC to the aerosol forcing, and that really kind of, let's see, I guess it masks, obviously, the greenhouse gas induced slowdown of AMOC. So I don't know quite what your question is exactly, but the mechanisms for the North Atlantic SST changes in these runs, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't looked at it very much, Helen, just honestly. And I think it is absolutely low-hanging fruit to do so. And also because I think there is
really regional and very much in the same region where we see the greenhouse gas induced.
Yeah, and I think the aerosol induced effect, I think it's partly a result of, you know, increased sea ice, Arctic sea ice, and therefore less, you know, sort of the opposite changes then on deep water formation and AMOC. So I think maybe to first order, that's what's happening there. And then I think that there is an impact on lower latitude climate, like rainfall over the Sahel from that SST, aerosol induced via AMOC SST changes in the North Atlantic. I think it would be very nice to pursue that.
Oh yeah, we should talk about that offline. Great.
Excellent. Great. Thank you.
And then there's a question now from Tim, I see.
Hi there, Clara.
Hi, Tim.
Hi there. Thank you. That was a really nice talk. Lots of interesting stuff there. I guess I was going to ask whether you've seen any particular sensitivities of the Walker circulation in your experiments. I guess that's motivated by I saw some kind of confusing papers suggesting that observations, if anything, show a positive trend in the Walker circulation, whereas from greenhouse gases we might expect a weakening trend. And I wondered if if there's an aerosol sensitivity there that might come out in your experiments.
I just think at least, these models may be wrong. And absolutely, I hope I don't fall into the trap of saying they are the real world. But, that Walker circulation trend, I think I know the paper that you're talking about. I mean, it's, of course, intimately connected with the cooling of the Eastern tropical Pacific that's been so pronounced and really sort of outside what models, including CESM1 does. I mean, we can get cooling trends over 50-year periods, but not with the magnitude I would say that's observed. But you know, if you remember my plots of the gray curves of the pattern correlations of the individual simulations, and actually I skipped the figure that picks out a couple of N members and shows you the trend maps for those individual simulations. You can get east-west changes in the tropical Pacific SSTs of absolutely opposite sign in the last 50 years of the historical period, you know, in these individual members. So I just think in our models, I would not, you know, yes, the planet is responding to greenhouse gases and aerosols, of course, but I just think it's very, it just too much of a leap to say that what we have observed in the tropical Pacific in terms of, you know, long-term trends is forced. And I think that's sort of the trap sometimes, that people sort of just quickly go to that explanation. And yeah, I just think I think one has to really consider, you know, the internal variability. I'd love to chat more with you about it.
Yeah, that's great. Let's do that. I'll see you soon in the gather.
Sounds good.
Thank you.